Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a document that literally redefined human history. We're going to examine the recently declassified 1946 Manhattan Engineer District Report on the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And you know, this isn't some retrospective analysis written decades later. This is the raw, highly engineered military data compiled immediately after the dust settled. We're going to look at the exact calculations of destruction, pulling straight from the original pages of this historic document.
Just take a look at the unevenly stamped letters of this 1946 typewriter font. Seeing the actual original page really grounds us in the historical reality of the moment. These pages were typed out by military officials who were trying to quantify an absolutely unprecedented level of devastation. It's sterile, it's bureaucratic, and it describes the instantaneous erasure of two whole cities.
The report kicks off by capturing the sudden shock delivered to the world, quoting President Truman's fateful public announcement. 16 hours ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima, Japan, and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb had more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. This was literally the very first time the public and the enemy learned of what Truman called the greatest scientific achievement in history, which was now unleashed as a weapon of war.
Now, the absolutely crucial detail here is that number, 20,000. To put that staggering scale into perspective, the report specifically notes that 20,000 tons of TNT equivalent made this single atomic bomb more than 2,000 times more powerful than the British Grand Slam. And up until that August morning, the Grand Slam was the largest bomb ever used in the history of warfare. So overnight, the ceiling of destructive capability didn't just inch upward, it was entirely shattered.
So here's our roadmap for breaking down this military data. We'll start with a new era of warfare, move right into selecting the targets, review the days of the attacks, examine the propaganda campaign, assess the devastation on the ground, and finally, look at the official conclusions drawn by the investigating teams.
All right, let's jump straight into Section 1, a new era of warfare. The creation of this weapon fundamentally shifted military capabilities, not over years or decades, but literally in a matter of hours. The abstract science of theoretical physics had instantly become the ultimate tool of strategic bombing. Moving right along to Section 2, selecting the targets. Now, you might be wondering, how does a military actually go about choosing where to drop a weapon that has never been used before? Well, the report reveals this chillingly calculated process led by mathematicians, physicists, and weather consultants. The criteria for selection were strictly engineered for maximum measurable devastation. They needed a target with a densely built-up area of at least 1 mile in radius. Why? Because the maximum blast effect was calculated to extend exactly that far. They specifically looked for a large percentage of closely built wooden frame buildings, knowing this would maximize the secondary damage from fires. And grimly enough, the target had to be relatively untouched by previous conventional bombing. That way, the effects of this single, brand new weapon could be perfectly isolated and measured. Geography played a massive role here too. Hiroshima was selected as the primary target mainly because it sat on a broad, flat delta. It was almost entirely flat and fully exposed to the blast. Nagasaki, on the other hand, was chosen later and had a drastically different layout. It was situated at the head of a long bay, divided by a mountain spur into two main valleys. As the engineers predicted, Nagasaki's irregular, hilly terrain would significantly alter and constrain the weapon's effects compared to the flat, open canvas of Hiroshima. Which brings us to Section 3, the days of the attacks. We're shifting our focus now to August 1945, looking closely at how the textbook execution of the first drop contrasted incredibly sharply with the sheer chaos unfolding on the ground. There's this really fascinating micro-narrative in the report. Think about it. How exactly did the Japanese capital even realize an entire major city had suddenly vanished in a fraction of a second? The realization didn't come from an immediate distress call, simply because there was no one left to make one. According to the declassified timeline, the bomb explodes at 8:15 a.m. Literally 1 minute later, a Tokyo radio operator simply notices the Hiroshima station had gone off the air. 20 minutes after that, railroad telegraph centers realized the main lines had just completely stopped working just north of the city. Confused reports trickled in, sure, but Tokyo headquarters assumed it was just a rumor. Finally, a young staff officer was dispatched by plane to go check it out. After flying for hours, while still nearly 100 miles away, he saw a massive cloud of smoke. When they arrived, they circled in disbelief over a great scar on the land that was still actively burning. Tokyo's definitive confirmation actually didn't come until 16 hours later from Washington's public announcement.
The human cost of that flat, exposed geography in Hiroshima was absolute. The report states that 66,000 people were killed instantly. Another 69,000 were injured. Over a fourth of the city's population was killed in one single stroke. It's so vital that we just pause and let that staggering human reality sink in, grounding these abstract clinical military calculations.
Now, while the Hiroshima mission was actually described as routine, the Nagasaki mission 3 days later was basically chaos. The report details tropical squalls, a companion plane that failed to rendezvous because of storms, and a target completely obscured by smoke and haze. After 3 unsuccessful bombing runs, running dangerously low on fuel while dodging anti-aircraft fire, they finally dropped the weapon over their secondary target, Nagasaki. The resulting mushroom cloud boiled up to 40,000 feet in less than 8 minutes.
Okay, moving into Section 4, the propaganda campaign. Immediately following the destruction, the military initiated an intense campaign of psychological warfare. The literal next day after Hiroshima, General Farrow received orders to weaponize this information. The sheer scale of the operation was just staggering. They proposed dropping 16 million leaflets over 47 Japanese cities, representing 40% of the entire population. They broadcasted warnings over shortwave radio every 15 minutes and dropped 500,000 Japanese-language newspapers showing actual pictures of the Hiroshima strike. The clear objective here was to leverage the unprecedented destruction to force an immediate surrender. Let's turn to Section 5, assessing the devastation. Once the hostilities actually ceased, the Manhattan Engineer District sent investigating teams directly into the rubble to assess the physical destruction on the ground.
When you actually read through this summary of damages, you're hit with this stark, almost jarring contrast between the sterile, bureaucratic categorizations used by the investigators and the apocalyptic reality they were actually describing. They literally walked through the ashes to carefully catalog exactly what happens to man-made structures and human bodies when subjected to nuclear forces.
They methodically broke down the casualties into 4 very clinical causes. First, flash burns caused directly by instantaneous heat radiation. Second, burns from the massive secondary fires that swept the cities. Third, mechanical injuries from collapsing buildings and people literally being hurled through the air by the pressure wave. And fourth, radiation injuries, which the report specifically noted occurred almost entirely during the very first second of the explosion.
But sometimes that objective tone just gives way to the sheer horror of what they were seeing. The investigators described Hiroshima's center as experiencing an immense firestorm driven by high winds blowing inward. They wrote, "A desert of clear-swept, charred remains, with only a few strong building frames left standing, was a terrifying sight." Finally, we reach Section 6, the official conclusions. Let's look at the ultimate findings from 1946 regarding the structural limits of cities and the exact nature of these weapons. Comparing the 2 drops actually reveals a really surprising detail. Even though Nagasaki's hills protected a wider area, the blast effects within the valleys were actually more severe than in Hiroshima. The report states that in Nagasaki, the heavy steel frames of huge industrial buildings within a mile of the explosion were pushed away, quote, as by a giant hand. So while multi-story brick buildings were demolished further out in Hiroshima, heavy reinforced concrete sustained severe damage much further out in Nagasaki. Now, an absolutely crucial takeaway regarding the aftermath, at least as they determined it in 1946, was about radiation. The official military findings stated there were no harmful amounts of persistent radioactivity present after the explosions. The investigators concluded that the radiation injuries were primarily instantaneous, occurring at the exact moment of detonation, and they found no clinical evidence of lingering radioactive hazards for those entering the cities later to do their surveys. So we've just unpacked the precise architectural planning of an atomic strike, straight from the original 1946 source document. I'll leave you with this question to ponder. How does reading the clinical, mathematically engineered calculations of such overwhelming destruction change our understanding of modern warfare? It's a chilling intersection of objective science and catastrophic human reality. Thank you for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.